Welcome to the Deep Dive podcast channel.
Great to be here.
Today, we're really going to explore something that comes up for so many of us, navigating the world, setting boundaries without getting tangled up in all that guilt.
Such a common struggle, isn't it? Finding
Yeah.
that delicate balance.
Yeah. We naturally want to connect with others, be supportive,
Of course.
but sometimes that desire, it just kind of overshadows our own needs and limits.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how difficult saying no can actually feel.
Exactly. And we've been looking at some interesting perspectives on why that no can feel so loaded almost like a betrayal sometimes. It's not just a simple word, is it? There can be a whole internal drama around it.
Definitely.
Our goal today is to gently unpack some of those deeper layers and maybe find some initial ways to approach boundary setting with a bit more understanding, for ourselves.
That's right. And we're not just talking about learning a few polite phrases to say no.
No.
Often, the difficulty with boundaries really has roots in our past experiences, right? And how our systems, both emotional and even neurological, have sort of adapted over time. It's about understanding those underlying patterns.
Oh, okay. And as we start to touch on some of these ideas, I'd love for you, our listener, to maybe start thinking about what resonates.
Yeah.
Where do you feel that little pinch of guilt when you even think about saying no?
Mhm.
What are the situations that feel particularly, tricky? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments later. It really does add to the conversation.
So let's dive into that familiar feeling.
Yeah.
Agreeing to something on the surface, maybe even putting on a smile.
Oh, yeah.
But inside, there's this quiet protest, this feeling that you've just overridden something really important within yourself.
Yeah, that internal yes escaping your lips while your whole being is screaming, absolutely not.
Right.
And it's followed by this draining feeling, maybe a bit of resentment starts simmering.
Yes.
And then that heavy blanket of guilt that just makes it even harder to speak your truth the next time around.
And what's so key to recognize here is that this isn't about a lack of willpower or some kind of inherent flaw.
Okay.
These patterns of over-agreeing, they often develop as protective mechanisms. They served a purpose at some point, maybe to keep connection or, avoid conflict in earlier experiences.
That really reframes it completely because saying no can feel incredibly threatening then, almost like we're risking something fundamental.
Precisely. For many people, setting a boundary can actually tap into very primal fears learned way back, fears of rejection, of being isolated, of potential punishment, or even abandonment if we don't meet expectations.
Wow. So it's much deeper than just feeling socially awkward. It's tied to our basic need for belonging and
Right.
And safety.
If you grew up in an environment where your own needs were maybe consistently dismissed or minimized,
Yeah.
or perhaps even met with negative reactions, you learn very quickly that prioritizing others' comfort, their expectations, it just feels like the safer route.
Makes sense.
And this can lead to those deeply ingrained people-pleasing tendencies, a habit of just pushing your own feelings aside
Right.
and developing this strong sense of responsibility for how other people are feeling.
And that feeling of terror you mentioned that can sometimes come up, it's not just like an exaggeration. People actually feel that.
Not at all. For some, the anticipation or even the act of setting a boundary can trigger a very real physical response,
Wow.
not just a mental feeling of guilt. The body, it remembers those early times where saying no might have genuinely led to negative outcomes.
Okay.
So the nervous system reacts defensively automatically, even in situations now where there isn't actually any real danger.
So recognizing that automatic yes as maybe a survival strategy,
Yes.
not some kind of moral failing, that's like the first step towards having a choice.
Exactly. That's the first step to conscious choice.
That connection between our past and how we react now is so insightful. And you also mentioned the crucial difference between guilt and shame.
Ah, yes. It's
Yeah.
vital.
Why is that so important?
Well, guilt is generally focused on an action. I did something that maybe goes against my values.
Okay.
Shame, though, that's a much deeper feeling about the self. I am inherently flawed or bad.
Right. I am bad.
Exactly. And for those who really struggle with boundaries, the guilt that comes after saying no is often compounded by this underlying shame, these deep-seated beliefs that their own needs, their own limits somehow make them unworthy or unlovable.
So when we finally manage to actually say no, It can unleash this really critical inner voice then.
Precisely. The shame-based inner critic often jumps right in with accusations like, oh, you're being selfish, or you're going to hurt their feelings, or maybe even you don't even deserve to have needs in the first place.
Ouch.
Yeah. And it's so important to understand that these harsh inner voices, they're often just echoes of past experiences.
Okay.
They're not reflections of your current reality or your inherent worth. They're what we sometimes call trauma echoes.
Trauma echoes. And it's not just our thoughts acting up, is it? You touched on how our nervous system actually reacts to the possibility of disapproval.
Right. So when we anticipate potential conflict or someone maybe being upset with our boundaries, our nervous system automatically kicks in these protective responses.
Like what?
Well, we might see a fawning response that's like over-apologizing or immediately trying to sort of smooth things over, placate the other person.
Okay, I know that one.
Right. There's also freezing, which can feel like numbness or detachment or just being unable to act. Flight might look like avoiding the situation entirely, and fight could involve becoming really defensive or overly explaining yourself.
These sound like they happen almost automatically, like they're involuntary.
Often they are, yeah. These responses are deeply ingrained, really rooted in our history of feeling unsafe.
Right.
It's our body's way of trying to protect us based on what happened before.
Yeah.
And understanding this can really shift how we view these reactions, moving away from self-blame towards recognizing them as just protective mechanisms doing their job, maybe an outdated job, but doing their job.
Okay. So recognizing these automatic nervous system responses helps us understand why it's so easy to fall back into those people-pleasing patterns, just to avoid those really uncomfortable feelings.
Exactly. Which leads us nicely into this idea of the people-pleaser's dilemma.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it starts as a strategy just to feel safe or, connected.
Right.
Precisely. People-pleasing often doesn't come from this genuine desire to always accommodate everyone. It's more like a learned survival tactic.
Yeah.
Someone might have absorbed the message, my job is to keep everyone happy, or their needs are more important than mine, or simply that being liked feels safer than being authentic.
Yeah.
So they adapt by suppressing their own needs, prioritizing others, all in an effort to secure that connection and avoid negative consequences.
But there's a big cost to that adaptation over time, isn't there?
A profound cost.
Yeah.
Self-abandonment. When we consistently prioritize others' needs above our own, we essentially disconnect from ourselves. We lose touch with our own desires, our own limits, what truly matters to us.
You also mentioned codependency and enmeshment earlier. How do those dynamics play into boundary struggles?
Well, in relationships or family systems where healthy boundaries are, let's say, blurred or just absent, which you often see in codependent or enmeshed dynamics.
Right.
Love and connection can get really tangled up with things like control or guilt or obligation.
Okay.
Individuals in these systems might have experienced being guilt-tripped for trying to gain independence or maybe shamed for just having personal needs.
Like what kind of thing?
Oh, for instance, someone might consistently call a loved one multiple times a day and then feel really personally offended if they don't answer immediately,
Yeah.
interpreting it as a rejection rather than just respecting their need for space or autonomy.
So in those kinds of relationships, saying no wouldn't just feel awkward. It could feel like you're breaking some kind of fundamental unspoken rule of the whole relationship.
Exactly. It can feel like a betrayal, even though arguably the real betrayal was the lack of respect for individual boundaries within that system in the first place.
The message being that your worth depends on meeting everyone else's needs.
Precisely. That implicit message.
And what about people who experienced emotional neglect growing up? How might that specifically impact their ability to set boundaries?
Oh, emotional neglect can be particularly tricky because it often involves a lack of attunement, a lack of responsiveness to a child's emotional world.
Okay.
So if someone grew up in an environment where their feelings just weren't acknowledged, where they weren't really given opportunities to express their needs or to say no safely, they might not even develop a strong sense of their own boundaries. They might learn to just suppress their needs to avoid feeling like a burden,
Right.
leading to what you might call a boundary vacuum,
Yeah.
a sense that something isn't quite right, but without a clear understanding of their own limits or even a feeling that they're entitled to assert them.
It's like they weren't even taught that having limits is normal, let alone healthy.
Exactly. There's often a complete lack of modeling for healthy emotional limits and, crucially, a lack of validation for their own internal experience.
And then we have attachment wounds, that fear of rejection. How do our early attachment experiences kind of shape how we handle boundaries later in life?
Well, our early attachment experiences really create a blueprint, you
Yeah.
know, for how we expect relationships to work and how we cope with the possibility of disconnection.
Okay.
So for someone with, say, an anxious attachment style,
Yeah.
saying no can trigger really intense fears of abandonment.
Hmm.
They might worry that setting a boundary will make the other person pull away their love or support.
Right.
Conversely, someone with a more avoidant attachment style might sort of preemptively withdraw
Ah.
to avoid the intimacy or potential conflict that can sometimes come up around boundary setting.
And disorganized.
And those with disorganized attachment patterns, yeah, they might show really inconsistent and often quite intense reactions to boundary-related situations. It can be very confusing for everyone involved.
So developing a more secure sense of self, building up those inner resources, is really crucial then for navigating those potential disconnections that might happen when you set boundaries.
Absolutely crucial.
Right.
It's about building that internal trust, that deep knowing that you can handle temporary discomfort or disagreement without losing yourself or your sense of worth in the process.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the why it's so hard to say no. Let's maybe shift focus a bit to those ingrained beliefs that often undermine our attempts to set boundaries even when we try. What are some common ones you see?
Oh, there are quite a few common negative beliefs that could really sabotage our boundary efforts. Thoughts like, I'm a bad person if I say no, or they won't like me anymore.
Yeah, the popularity contest fear.
Totally.
Yeah.
Or they'll think I'm selfish, my needs aren't as important as theirs, or even that really core fear of, I'll end up alone if I don't always say yes.
And these often operate kind of under the surface, don't they? Making them harder to tackle.
Exactly. Often at a subconscious level.
So how do we even begin to unpack and address these really deep-rooted beliefs?
Well, the very first step is just bringing them into conscious awareness. Actually noticing these thoughts and feelings when they pop up around the idea of setting a boundary.
Just noticing.
Just noticing first. Then it's about questioning their validity. Asking yourself, okay, is this belief actually true right now in this situation?
Okay.
What evidence do I have to support it, and what evidence contradicts it? And then consciously working to replace those negative beliefs with more positive and, frankly, more realistic affirmations.
Like what? Could you give an example?
Sure. So shifting from, I'm selfish if I say no, to something like, it's actually healthy to have needs, and saying no protects my well-being.
I like that. Can you share maybe one or two more reframes?
Okay. Instead of say, they'll abandon me if I set this limit, you could try affirming, healthy relationships actually respect individual needs and boundaries. And instead of that deep feeling of, my needs aren't valid, a really powerful affirmation is simply, my needs are real and they matter just as much.
It sounds like it takes practice, consistency.
It absolutely does.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be incredibly liberating when it starts to sink in.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be transformative because constantly overriding our own needs, it must take a huge toll, right? You called it the high cost of always saying yes.
A cumulative impact can be really significant.
Yeah.
We often see increased levels of stress,
Wow.
burnout, resentment, just building and building, heightened anxiety, and even a kind of blurring of our own sense of identity.
Losing touch with yourself.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
When we're constantly operating in service of others without regard for our own limits, we can genuinely lose touch with who we are and what we actually value.
And even in our closest relationships, if they're built on this pattern of us always being the accommodator,
Yeah.
they can start to feel, I don't know, hollow or maybe inauthentic.
That's a perfect word for it. Inauthentic.
Mm-hmm.
Because the connection isn't based on the real you.
Mm.
It's based on a version of you that's constantly giving without receiving adequate care and respect for your own limits in return.
It sounds almost paradoxical, but you also spoke about the healing power of boundaries. How can setting limits actually strengthen our connections with people?
Because genuine connection, the really good stuff, it thrives on mutual respect,
Okay.
on emotional honesty, and on the autonomy of each person involved. Boundaries provide clarity.
Clarity.
They communicate, look, this is where my limits are, and this is what I need to feel safe and respected in this relationship.
Yeah.
And that fosters an environment where both people can actually show up authentically.
Right.
Rather than one person constantly sacrificing their own well-being for the sake of, well, keeping the peace.
So boundaries aren't really about creating distance then. They're more about defining the space where a healthy, sustainable connection can actually grow and flourish.
Precisely. Couldn't have said it better.
You also highlighted something really interesting, the importance of somatic awareness. Paying attention to our body's signals when we're thinking about setting a boundary.
Yes. Our bodies often register discomfort or resistance long before our conscious minds fully process the situation.
Like what kind of signals?
Oh, things like a sudden tightening in your chest or a knot forming in your stomach, shallow breathing, muscle tension creeping in.
Yeah.
These can all be physical indicators of your inner no. Learning to tune into these bodily signals and actually respect what they're telling you.
Respect them. Okay.
That can build a much deeper sense of self-trust, which is absolutely fundamental for setting healthy boundaries consistently.
It's like our body holds this wisdom that we sometimes just override with our desire to please or, avoid conflict.
Exactly. And by just acknowledging these body-based no's, we begin to validate our own internal experience, even when our minds are busy trying to rationalize saying yes.
Okay. So for someone listening who finds boundary setting really, really challenging, where do they even begin to build this muscle, as you called it? You mentioned small truth telling.
Yes, you don't need to start with, major confrontations. That's often too much.
Right.
Begin with small, less threatening assertions, little things. Phrases like, let me think about that and get back to you.
Yeah.
That buys you time.
Okay.
Or a simple, that doesn't work for me right now. Or even just, I'm not available then.
Simple.
Simple, but powerful. The key is to allow the discomfort that arises, because it probably will.
Yeah.
Allow that discomfort of not immediately saying yes to just be present without immediately trying to fix it by caving in.
It's about tolerating that initial wave of anxiety that comes with not automatically accommodating others, learning to sit with it.
Precisely. You're gradually, slowly rewiring potentially years of automatic agreement into a more conscious and ultimately self-respecting way of responding.
And when those feelings of guilt or fear do inevitably surface after setting a boundary, what are some helpful strategies right there in the moment? You mentioned nervous system regulation.
Yes, that's crucial, because the feelings will come up initially.
Right.
When those feelings of guilt or anxiety arise, it's so important to have some go-to techniques to help regulate your nervous system, bring it back to a calmer state.
What kind of things?
Oh, really simple things, like just placing a hand on your heart and taking some slow, deep breaths, maybe gently reminding yourself, I am safe right now, and it's okay for me to honor my needs. Gentle physical movement can also really help release tension. Even simple actions like humming or gargling, believe it or not.
Really? Gargling?
Yeah, they can stimulate the vagus nerve, which is key in helping to calm the nervous system down.
Okay, good tips. So it's about grounding ourselves in the present moment and reassuring ourselves that we are okay, even if there's some temporary discomfort or someone else isn't happy.
Exactly. And remembering that guilt isn't always a reliable guide in these situations.
Oh, no, so
Sometimes it's just an echo, like we said, an echo of past experiences that needs to be soothed and acknowledged, not necessarily obeyed as a moral imperative.
Okay. And ultimately, it seems like the big goal here is to shift from constantly looking outside for validation
Yes.
to cultivating that inner sense of self-worth, what you referred to as internal validation.
That's really where the true freedom lies. External validation, it can feel good in the moment,
Yeah.
but it's fleeting and it's totally dependent on other people. Internal validation is about generating that self-acceptance, that self-compassion from within.
So it's about telling yourself.
It's about being able to say to yourself, I matter, even if someone is disappointed by my no, or setting this boundary is actually an act of self-respect, or even, I don't need everyone to understand my boundaries for me to stand by them.
It's about becoming your own primary source of approval then, so you're not constantly relying on others to tell you you're worthy.
Precisely. When you truly belong to yourself first, you're no longer outsourcing your sense of value or your sense of safety to the whims of others.
This has been such a rich and valuable exploration. Wow. To kind of bring it all together, you mentioned earlier that no can be seen as a sacred word. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I really believe that. Saying no, when it aligns with your truth, is an act of profound courage and self-respect. It's a way of reclaiming your time, your energy, your focus, your very sense of self. It's about returning to your own center.
Reclaiming.
Reclaiming. If you weren't taught healthy boundaries growing up, that wasn't your fault at all. But now, as an adult, you have the opportunity to learn to honor your own truth. Choosing the temporary discomfort of saying no over the long-term soul-eroding cost of self-abandonment. That is a powerful act of self-preservation.
Yeah.
In that sense, no signifies your existence, your limits, and ultimately your inherent self-worth. It says, I am here and I matter.
That's a really powerful way to frame it. No, as an affirmation of self. Wow, we've covered so much important ground today, and it's clear that learning to set boundaries without that baggage of guilt it's a deeply personal journey, isn't it?
Very much so.
We did have a few common questions come up that I thought would be really helpful to just touch on briefly before we wrap things up.
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, one frequent question is, why do I still feel guilty, even when the boundary I set is completely reasonable and fair?
Yeah, that's a classic. As we discussed, that lingering guilt often stems from those deeply ingrained patterns in our nervous system.
The echoes.
The echoes, exactly, formed through past experiences. It's an emotional reflex almost that doesn't necessarily reflect the reality or the rightness of the present situation. It's just the old alarm going off.
Okay, another common one. How can I be clear with my boundaries without sounding mean or unkind? People worry about that a lot.
Understandably. The key, I think, is to try and combine clarity with compassion. You can be direct and firm about your limit while still expressing care or appreciation for the other person.
Can you give an example?
Sure. You might say something like, I really appreciate you thinking of me for this, and unfortunately that doesn't work for me right now. Or, I care about you and state your need clearly.
Clear but kind. Okay. And what if the other person gets upset or even angry when you set a boundary? That's a big fear.
Huge fear. It's really important to remember here that you are responsible for communicating your needs and limits respectfully.
Right.
But you are not responsible for the other person's emotional reaction to your boundary.
Okay, say that again. Not responsible for their reaction.
Not responsible for their reaction, their anger, their disappointment. It's about their own experience, their own expectations, maybe their own boundary issues. It's not necessarily a reflection on your worth or the validity of your boundary.
That's a freeing thought. Someone also asked, how do I know if I'm setting too many boundaries? Is that possible?
Well, frame it differently. A healthy boundary is one that supports your overall well-being, your peace of mind, your energy levels, your sense of self, your safety.
Okay.
If a boundary helps you maintain those things without, say, isolating yourself in a way that feels genuinely unhealthy or disconnected to you, then it's likely serving its purpose. Boundaries are inherently personal.
Right.
They'll look different for everyone, and they might even change depending on the context or the relationship. There's no universal too much. It's about what preserves your integrity and peace.
Okay, that makes sense. And for those who are really just starting to explore this, maybe feeling overwhelmed, a big question is often, what's the very first small step I can take to start setting boundaries?
Begin small, really small. Low-stakes situations are your friend here.
Right.
Practice just pausing before automatically saying yes to something minor. Try using those buffer phrases we mentioned, like, let me think about it, or I need to check my schedule. That gives you space.
Buys you time.
Buys you time to actually check in with yourself. Even just one honest sentence acknowledging your limit, like I can't manage that this week, is a huge step forward. Small wins build momentum.
One honest sentence. I like that. Finally, someone asked, can setting boundaries actually help reduce my anxiety in the long run?
Oh, absolutely. It might feel anxiety-provoking in the moment when you're first starting.
Right.
But over time, yes. By creating more predictability and a greater sense of control and agency in your interactions, boundaries actually help to soothe your nervous system.
How so?
Because you know your limits. You trust yourself more to uphold them, and you're communicating them more clearly. This creates a much greater sense of safety, clarity, and emotional regulation in your relationships, which almost always reduces overall anxiety levels.
That's incredibly helpful. Wow, so much food for thought there. We truly hope this exploration has offered you some new perspectives, maybe some comfort, on the often complex topic of setting boundaries without that heavy weight of guilt.
Yeah, it's a journey for sure.
It really is. Remember, just understanding the roots of these challenges, as we've talked about, can be the very first and most important step towards greater self-compassion and ultimately empowerment.
Be gentle with yourself.
Definitely. We encourage you to take some time, maybe just reflect on what resonated most with you today, and perhaps consider one small, manageable step you might be willing to take this week towards honoring your own needs just a little bit more.
One small step.
Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. We really value your engagement and always look forward to continuing this conversation down in the comments section.
Thanks, everyone.